A weary police officer stumbles upon a little girl dragging a broken cart through a dark alley. On that cart lies her unconscious mother, pale, bruised, barely breathing. The girl's tearful eyes meet his, and with trembling hands she whispers, "Please, save my mom." In that instant, everything changes. An officer, a child, and a loyal German shepherd step into a story of courage, betrayal, and hope that will test the limits of love and justice. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. I'd love to hear your city or country. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these true-to-heart stories. Wishing you a warm and blessed day ahead. The winter night had settled heavily over the mountain town of Silver Pine, a place tucked into the ridges of Colorado, where the wind carried with it the scent of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. Snow had been falling all evening, laying a thick blanket over rooftops, sidewalks, and the narrow lanes that wound between the old brick buildings downtown. The air was sharp, every breath leaving a white trail behind. Streetlights glowed faintly through the curtain of flakes, their halos trembling in the cold gusts. Most people had long since shut their doors against the weather, but one man remained out on patrol, the crunch of his boots steady, accompanied by the quiet but vigilant presence of the animal at his side. David Monroe, once a decorated detective and now the town's police chief, was a man of 45 who carried the kind of weight that did not show on his broad shoulders alone, but in the depth of his hazel eyes. His hair was dark brown, streaked with gray at the temples, trimmed close but unruly enough to betray his long hours and disregard for appearances beyond necessity. He was tall and broad-chested, the kind of figure that made strangers instinctively step aside, yet those who knew him spoke of his quiet patience, the steadiness in his voice when tempers rose, the way he preferred listening before speaking. Beneath his heavy navy police winter coat, a badge gleamed faintly, but it was not the badge that defined him. Years ago, he had lost his only daughter in a tragic accident on an icy road, and the grief had pressed itself into his bones, reshaping him into a man who had learned to live among shadows. That wound never truly closed, and though he rarely spoke of it, the pain colored the way he looked at the world, with both suspicion and an aching sense of duty to protect the vulnerable. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose thick black and silver coat glistened under the drifting snowflakes. Ranger was muscular but lean, his movements graceful, ears pricked high at every sound. His amber eyes seemed almost human in their alertness, scanning every doorway, every corner of the dimly lit street. He had been trained as a K-9 during David's earlier years in law enforcement, and had once faced down armed suspects with unwavering courage, but now, semi-retired, he served as David's companion and guardian in equal measure. Though calm around those he trusted, he could turn into a wall of muscle and teeth when danger drew near. To David, Ranger was more than a partner. He was the last living connection to the years before tragedy struck, the only presence that could pull him back from the edge of solitude. That evening, David had chosen to walk rather than drive, preferring the quiet rhythm of his boots in the snow and the grounding weight of Ranger's leash in his hand. They moved past shuttered shops and dim taverns, their patrol a mix of habit and necessity. The town had seen its share of trouble in recent years, drug runners testing the borders, missing persons whose trails ran cold in the mountain woods. But tonight had seemed calm, the silence broken only by the distant hum of a train and the barking of a stray dog carried on the wind. David pulled his scarf tighter, his breath clouding before him, when suddenly Ranger stiffened, a low growl rumbling from his chest. The sound came from the next block, where the main road narrowed into a damp alley, known more for discarded crates than for people at this hour. David slowed his pace, one hand instinctively brushing the holster at his side, the other loosening Ranger's leash. The German shepherd pulled forward, nose working furiously, every muscle taut. As they turned into the alley, the dim light from a single flickering street lamp revealed a figure, small and trembling, struggling to drag something along the uneven ground. At first glance, David thought it was a child carrying firewood or scraps, but as his eyes adjusted, the truth struck like ice. A frail little girl, no more than 8, was pulling a rickety wooden cart with a rope that cut into her small hands. Her dress, a faded wool garment too thin for the biting cold, clung damply to her slender frame. Her hair, chestnut brown and tangled, fell in wet strands across her pale cheeks, streaked with dirt and tears. Her storm-gray eyes were wide and frantic, locked not on David, but on the weight she dragged. On the cart lay the still form of a woman. The child froze at the sight of him, shrinking back instinctively, her body pressed against the handle of the cart as though to shield what lay on it. Her voice cracked in a desperate plea that carried through the alley like a blade cutting through the hush. "Please save my mom. I beg you. Please help her." David's breath caught. He had seen countless emergencies in his career, but there was something about the raw desperation in the girl's voice, the way she clung to the cart, that pierced deeper than he expected. He took a slow step forward, lowering his hand away from his holster, raising the other to show calm. Ranger stood close, ears perked but body still, sensing his master's signal to remain steady. "What happened, sweetheart?" David asked, his tone low but urgent, the kind of voice that invited trust without force. The girl's lips trembled. "My mom, she won't wake up. I pulled her out from there. I didn't know what else to do." Tears welled again, and she bit her lip so hard it left a mark. David knelt on the cold cement, his coat brushing the snow, and leaned over the cart. The woman's breathing was shallow, her lips cracked and dry, her face gaunt as though life itself had been drained away. She was in her early 30s, her once bright features dulled by exhaustion and suffering. A faded bruise, yellow-green with age but unmistakable in shape, marred the edge of her jaw. David recognized it immediately, the kind of imprint left by violence, not accident. He slipped his own coat off and draped it gently over her frail shoulders. The girl instantly panicked, clutching her mother tighter. "Don't take her away," she cried, her small hands trembling as they pressed against the blanket. David paused, softening his eyes, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. "I'm not taking her away. I only want to help your mother. We'll go together, all right?" For a long moment, the girl's wide eyes searched his face, as if weighing whether trust was something she could still afford. Finally, with the faintest nod, she loosened her grip just enough for him to adjust the coat around her mother more securely. Ranger stepped closer, lowering his head to sniff the woman's hand, then gave a quiet whine, a sound of recognition that this was someone in need of protection. David studied the girl again, noting the resilience beneath her fear. Her name was still unknown, her story untold, but in that frozen alley, he knew one thing with certainty. He had stumbled not upon chance misfortune, but into a beginning that would alter his path forever. The snow swirled thicker around them, muffling the world beyond the alley. Somewhere in the distance, the growl of an engine echoed, headlights flickering briefly at the far end before disappearing into the night. Ranger barked once, low and warning. David narrowed his eyes, committing the sound and sight to memory. Something was not right here. He bent down again, meeting the girl's tear-filled gaze. "You're safe now. I promise you." And with that promise, though he did not yet know it, the course of his life began to shift. The drive back to David Monroe's home was slow through the snow-drifted streets, headlights cutting through the white haze as silence wrapped around the car like a shroud. Emily sat in the back seat, pressed tightly against her unconscious mother, her thin arms wrapped around Maria's shoulders, as though her grip alone could anchor her to life. Ranger sat beside them, the German shepherd's broad body braced, ears flicking with every sound beyond the glass, amber eyes never leaving the trembling child. David drove with steady hands, though inside his chest his pulse thundered. He had spent his career witnessing crises, but this felt different. This felt personal. His house rose on the edge of Silver Pine's forest line, a tall colonial structure of brick and stone built decades earlier. Once it had been filled with laughter, the footsteps of his wife and daughter echoing in the halls. Now it was a place too large for one man and one dog, every polished surface echoing the absence of what had been lost. David parked near the side entrance and hurried to lift Maria into his arms. She was startlingly light, her head lolling weakly against his chest, her lips faintly blue. Emily scurried alongside, clutching Ranger's fur as though the dog was her only tether to courage. Inside the foyer, the warmth of the central heating did little to erase the chill in the girl's eyes. The tall ceiling, the chandelier casting soft light, the polished wood floors. It was all too pristine, too empty. David laid Maria carefully on the living room sofa, adjusting a folded quilt beneath her. Emily dropped to her knees beside her mother, tugging the blanket tighter around her. Ranger settled near the couch, his chin on his paws, eyes alert to every flicker of movement. David pulled off his gloves and coat, placing them neatly on the side table, and then retrieved his phone. His first call went to Dr. Helen Carter, an old friend of his late wife's and the town's most trusted physician. Helen was a woman in her early 50s, tall and composed, her auburn hair tied neatly in a bun. She had the presence of someone accustomed to sudden emergencies, her calm a natural shield against panic. Years before, she had lost her husband to a mining accident and had raised her 2 children alone. That hardship had shaped her into a person of deep empathy and resilience. When David asked if she could come immediately, she needed no convincing, only told him to have warm towels ready. As he ended the call, soft footsteps approached from the side hallway. A man in his late 50s appeared, dressed impeccably in a dark suit despite the late hour. This was Miller, the Monroe family's butler for over 20 years. He had been tall once, but now stooped slightly at the shoulders, his hair silver and neatly parted, his face lined yet dignified. To townsfolk, he was the epitome of loyalty, reserved, efficient, discreet. To David, he was a man who had stood beside him, enduring his deepest grief, managing the house when David could barely function. Yet even in loyalty, there were shadows. "Sir," Miller said in his measured baritone, setting a tray down with cups of tea, though no one had asked. His eyes flickered briefly toward Maria before returning to David. "Shall I prepare a guest room?" "Not yet," David replied, voice low. "She's too weak to move. Dr. Carter will be here soon." Miller inclined his head with practiced deference, but as he turned, David noticed the faintest hesitation in his step, his gaze brushing against the security control panel mounted by the wall. The glance lasted less than a second, but it was enough to stir unease in David's gut. Ranger gave a low growl, a sound subtle but unmistakable, before laying his head back down. Emily, too, seemed to notice something. Her small frame hunched tighter against her mother as Miller's footsteps receded, and she pressed her cheek to Maria's arm, whispering words David could not catch. He crouched beside her, softening his voice. "Dr. Carter is on her way. Your mother will get help. No one is going to take her away from you." The girl lifted her eyes, storm gray shimmering with tears. "Everyone else walked past us." I begged them, but no one stopped. "Why are you helping?" David hesitated, his chest tightening. "Because I should have helped sooner, once before, and I will not fail again." Emily tilted her head, studying him with a depth far older than her years. She did not speak, only nodded faintly and returned her focus to Maria. Minutes later, the sharp rap of knuckles sounded at the door. David rose quickly and opened it to reveal Dr. Helen Carter, her white coat draped over her shoulders, a leather medical bag in her hand. Snow clung to the hem of her boots, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her composure was unshaken. Without pause, she crossed the threshold and knelt beside Maria, checking pulse, eyes, and breathing. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, stress collapse," Helen murmured, hands moving with efficiency. "David, bring me clean towels and a kettle of hot water. Emily, sweetheart, can you sit here and hold your mother's hand? She'll feel you near." Emily obeyed instantly, her thin fingers trembling as they closed around Maria's. Helen prepared an IV line, her motions steady even as the little girl's breath quickened at the sight of the needle. "Don't be frightened," Helen soothed. "This will give her strength back." The drip began, clear fluid sliding through the line into Maria's arm. While Helen worked, Miller reappeared carrying extra blankets. His voice was smooth as ever. "Shall I reduce the staff presence tomorrow to avoid questions in town, sir?" David met his gaze, measuring him. "Do it. Tell them I'm away on business." Miller bowed slightly and set the blankets down, yet his fingers lingered on the edge. Of the tray too long, his keys clinking faintly. Emily shivered though the room was warm. Ranger lifted his head, eyes following Miller until he disappeared again into the hall. Helen leaned back, satisfied for now. She'll need monitoring, but her vitals are stabilizing. If she stays warm, she should wake in a few hours. David exhaled, tension easing slightly, but unease remained. He glanced at Emily, who sat curled against the sofa. sketching nervously in a small notebook pulled from her backpack. When she realized his eyes were on her, she turned the page toward him. On it, she had drawn two shadows on a wall, one tall and upright, the other small, pressed close beside it. David's throat tightened. It was not simply a child's drawing, it was a silent plea. Before he could respond, the distant sound of a car engine drifted through the frosted windows, lingering for a moment before fading away. Ranger's ears perked, his body rising to attention. David crossed to the window, peering through the glass into the snowy darkness, but saw only the flicker of a street lamp and the endless curtain of falling flakes. Still, the unease remained, a shadow lingering in the corners of his mind. He returned to the living room, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay by your mother's side, Emily. I'll keep watch." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and the faintest glimmer of hope. She nodded, her hand tightening protectively over Maria's. Ranger settled once more by the sofa, head resting on his paws but body taut, ready. The house was warm, but David felt the cold of suspicion creeping in. For all its polished walls and chandeliers, Silver Pine's shadows had followed him home. And for the first time in years, he realized the fight waiting in those shadows was no longer his alone. The hours stretched thin through the night in Silver Pine, the snow outside falling heavier, pressing silence into every corner of David Monroe's house. The living room glowed in amber light from the lamp, shadows stretching across the walls where Emily sat curled in a chair, her notebook open in her lap. Ranger lay at her feet, the German shepherd's thick coat dusted with stray flakes of snow that had not yet melted, his ears twitching at every creak of the old beams above. Maria still lay on the sofa, her breath slow and shallow, the IV line Helen Carter had left in place dripping rhythmically. David had not moved far from her side. It was near dawn when Maria stirred, her eyelids fluttering open with effort, her voice a rasp of broken syllables. Emily leapt to her knees at once, clutching her mother's hand. "Mom, you're awake. Please don't leave me." Tears traced down the girl's pale cheeks. David leaned closer, his deep-set eyes softening. "You're safe. You're in my home." Rest easy Maria Alvarez, a woman in her early 30s, looked worn beyond her years. Her auburn brown hair, tangled and dulled by neglect, fell around her face in uneven strands. Her skin, though naturally fair, was marked with shadows of exhaustion, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. Once she might have carried herself with quiet dignity, but life had stripped her of it, leaving only a fragile determination to protect her child. Her first words were not of herself, but of her daughter. Did Emily eat? Did she sleep? That question alone revealed her nature, selfless even in ruin. Emily clung to her, whispering, "I stayed awake with you all night." Ranger stayed too. At the sound of his name, the German shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the dimness, and let out a soft huff, as if to confirm the girl's words. David straightened, his voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. "Maria, I need to know what happened. You and your daughter didn't just collapse in that alley by accident. Who did this to you?" Maria's gaze wavered, fear rippling across her face. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again, as if she feared the very walls might be listening. Emily pressed her head against her mother's arm, whispering encouragement, her storm-gray eyes glistening. "Tell him, Mom." "He won't let them hurt us again." David pulled a chair close, the lines in his face deepened by the lamplight. "I've seen many things in this town. I've buried too many truths that others tried to hide. But I won't bury yours, not if it endangers a child." Maria's body shook as she drew in a breath. Slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. She told him of a man in Denver who had approached her with an offer, a job in hospitality, housing included, a chance to start over after her husband abandoned them. Desperate and without family, she had agreed. The first days seemed promising until her documents were taken for safekeeping. After that, the tone changed. She and other women were loaded onto a gray truck, its right side door marred by a long scrape of metal. Emily, though only a child, had seen it too. She whispered into the silence, "Beep, beep," the sound it made when it backed up. I remember Maria closed her eyes, trembling. "They locked us inside a warehouse, guarded at all hours. Anyone who resisted was silenced with fists or worse. I tried to stay invisible, but when Emily cried at night, they threatened to take her away. That's when I knew I had to escape. By some miracle, I found a way during a supply delivery. I ran until my legs gave out. But we can never go back. If they find us... Her voice cracked, the words swallowed by tears. David's jaw tightened, his hazel eyes darkening with a storm of both anger and memory. He rose from his chair and stepped toward the fireplace, his broad back framed against the glow. In the flames he saw another memory. His daughter, Lily, with her blonde curls and laugh like sunlight, waving from the porch the last morning he saw her. A reckless driver on an icy road had stolen her away before he could save her. He had sworn then that no other child under his watch would be left unprotected. Ranger stood and padded over to him, pressing his head against David's leg as though sensing the shift in his thoughts. David knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears, grounding himself in the present. "Maria," he said firmly, turning back, "if what you describe is true, then this is bigger than one woman's misfortune. This is organized. This is a crime ring operating under our noses, and I will not allow them to keep hunting you." Maria shook her head violently, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. They have eyes everywhere. I saw men in uniforms, maybe guards, maybe worse. If I talk, they'll come for Emily." David lowered his voice, calm but immovable. "They already came. You ran. You're here. That tells me they underestimated your will to survive. Now they will learn they underestimated mine." Emily looked between them, her small face pale but determined. "I'll help. I remember things." I won't forget David crouched beside her, placing one steady hand on her shoulder. "Your job is not to fight, Emily. Your job is to stay safe. Let me and Ranger carry the danger." Ranger, as if on cue, pressed his nose to her arm, and Emily let out a tiny laugh through her tears, burying her face into the dog's thick fur. From the hall, soft steps approached again. Miller appeared, holding a tray of soup he had reheated from the kitchen. His silver hair gleamed under the light, his posture immaculate. "Sir, the doctor requested Maria take some warm broth once she's able. Shall I bring it here?" His eyes flicked briefly to the IV, then to Maria herself, before resting back on David. "Leave it on the table," David said flatly, not breaking eye contact. Miller nodded smoothly and retreated once more, but unease tightened David's gut. Maria tried to sit up, whispering, "I can't stay here long. I've brought danger to your home." David shook his head. "You're not leaving until you can walk on your own strength." And even then, I decide the next step. He glanced toward the window, where snow still pressed against the glass, and in the reflection he saw Emily, small and steadfast, clutching Ranger like a shield. He saw Maria, broken but unyielding for her daughter's sake. And in the space where his daughter's laughter once echoed, he saw a chance, not to erase his grief, but to honor it by protecting these two souls who had stumbled into his care. The snow outside thickened, a wall of white blurring the street beyond. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine idled briefly before vanishing into silence. Ranger growled low in his throat. David's eyes narrowed. There were whispers in this town, whispers that danger was nearer than any of them knew. But for now, the truth had begun to surface, and David knew there was no turning back. The morning light came late in Silverpine, filtered through layers of cloud and snow still tumbling from the mountains. By the time dawn had touched the town, the Monroe residence was already awake with tension. David had been pacing the wide hallway outside the living room since first light, pausing now and again at the tall window that overlooked the front gates. The snow had eased, but what he saw there struck him cold. A neat bouquet of white lilies resting just beyond the iron bars, their petals already catching frost. A silent message that someone knew too much. Ranger padded to his side, his breath fogging the glass as his nose pressed against it. The German shepherd gave a sharp bark, ears pricked and body stiff. David laid a calming hand on his back, though his own pulse was far from calm. He opened the door, stepped into the chill, and crouched beside the flowers. They were tied with a plain white ribbon, no note, no delivery slip. Yet, in his years on the force, David had seen such gestures before, not gifts, but warnings. When he brought the bouquet inside, Emily's eyes widened. She had been sitting cross-legged on the rug beside Ranger's blanket, sketching once again in her notebook. The little girl looked pale, her storm-gray eyes clouded with unease. "It's like the flowers they left for the women," she whispered, voice trembling. "When someone disappeared, they left white flowers." She clutched the notebook tighter, as though the act of drawing could shield her from memory. David crouched beside her, lowering his voice. "You're safe here. They don't decide your story anymore." He brushed a lock of chestnut hair from her cheek and nodded toward Ranger. "And he won't let anyone near you without me knowing." The dog gave a low rumble of agreement, settling his head on Emily's lap, his amber eyes softening only for her. Maria, though stronger than the night before, struggled to sit upright on the sofa. Her face still carried shadows of exhaustion, but her gaze was sharp as it landed on the flowers. "They've found us already," she murmured, panic edging her tone. "We have to leave before—" "Running will only keep you in their hands," David interrupted firmly, his voice deep but steady. "This isn't just about hiding. It's about ending what they've done." He set the flowers down on the coffee table, as if staking a claim, his hazel eyes hardening with resolve. From the hallway, Miller appeared, his silver hair combed back impeccably, a tray of fresh tea balanced on his hands. "A curious delivery, sir," he observed, his tone mild, though his eyes lingered on the flowers longer than necessary. His suit was pressed, his tie perfectly straight, yet there was a subtle weariness in his step that had not been there years ago. "Shall I dispose of them?" David shook his head. "Leave them." "I want to remember the message." Miller inclined his head and withdrew, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wood floor. Emily's small hand slipped into David's, her grip surprisingly strong for her size. "I don't like him," she whispered. "His eyes don't match his smile." David said nothing, but Ranger's ears flicked as though in agreement. The day stretched on in uneasy quiet. Helen Carter arrived mid-morning to check Maria's condition. She entered briskly, snow still caught in her auburn hair, her white coat trailing behind her. After examining Maria and noting her improved pulse and steadier breathing, she turned her attention to Emily, urging her to eat. Emily resisted at first, but softened under Helen's steady gaze, taking small bites of toast as Ranger lay watchful beside her. Helen glanced at the bouquet, her brow furrowing. "That's no accident. Someone placed it there knowing you'd see." Her voice was calm, but laced with steel. "You'll need to prepare for worse before this gets better." Later, as dusk drew near, David walked the upstairs hallway where family portraits still hung, dust clinging to the frames. His footsteps slowed before a picture of his late daughter, Lily. She was frozen in time with her blonde curls tied high, hugging a stuffed fox to her chest. Her smile was wide, eyes bright with the trust of a child who believed her father could fix anything. David reached out, his rough fingers brushing the glass. The ache rose sharp in his throat. It was then Emily appeared at the end of the hall, holding her notebook. She padded quietly closer, her boots leaving small prints in the dust of the old carpet. "She looks kind," she whispered, pointing to the photograph. "Is that your little girl?" David nodded, his jaw tight. "Her name was Lily." He did not elaborate, but his eyes gave away more than words. Emily lowered her gaze, then carefully tore a page from her notebook. On it was a sketch, a tall figure standing beside a smaller one, the smaller clutching the leash of a German shepherd, a faint sun drawn in the corner. She handed it to him. "Maybe she'd like to know you're helping us now." David accepted the drawing silently, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, the weight of his grief shifted, not erased, but joined by something fragile and new. Downstairs, Maria stirred awake to find Ranger lying close by, his head resting against the sofa. She reached down, her fingers brushing through his thick fur, and whispered, "You're loyal, aren't you? You don't doubt. You don't betray." Ranger closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, the steady warmth of a guardian who asked for nothing in return. Evening fell heavy, the snow outside slowing to a light drizzle that glistened under street lamps. David sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the yard. The bouquet of white lilies still lay on the table, their petals beginning to droop. They were no gift of beauty, but a mark of warning, proof that the enemy had eyes even here. And as he looked from Maria, resting uneasily, to Emily, curled beside Ranger on the rug, he knew the fight that waited beyond his gates was no longer only his. It was bound to them all. Night pressed against Silverpine like a living thing, the sky heavy with low clouds that swallowed the stars. In David Monroe's home, the lamps burned low, shadows stretching across the walls like silent intruders. The bouquet of lilies still rested on the table, their petals sagging, but their meaning sharp as ever. David sat at his desk, his large hands folded, his hazel eyes fixed on the blueprint of his property spread out before him. Every gate, every service road, every entry point was sketched in detail. He traced the south gate with his finger, jaw clenched. It was Miller who interrupted the silence, appearing at the doorway with the air of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He was immaculate as ever, his silver hair slicked back, his tie knotted tight. His calm, low voice carried a strange authority, the kind built from years of discretion. "Sir, if I may," he began, "given the bouquet this morning, it might be wise to relocate the guests discreetly. The south gate would be the least noticeable exit. From there, the old service road leads down to Miller's Creek. A vehicle could meet you without drawing attention." David's eyes lifted slowly from the blueprint, narrowing slightly. "And you're certain about that?" Miller inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "I've lived on this estate long enough to know its quietest paths." Before David could answer, Emily, who had been sitting on the rug with Ranger sprawled beside her, looked up sharply. Her storm-gray eyes carried a weight beyond her years. "The south gate," she whispered. "That's where I heard trucks before. The bad ones." Ranger, as if sensing her unease, pressed closer to her, tail stiff, a low growl humming from his throat. David placed a hand on the dog's back, quieting him. Though his own suspicion echoed the growl, he turned back to Miller. "I'll consider it," he said flatly. Miller bowed slightly and retreated, his polished shoes clicking down the hallway. The tension hung thick even after his departure. Maria, now able to sit upright for longer stretches, clasped Emily's hand tightly. "We can't run again," she murmured, her voice thin but steady. "If they expect us at that gate, they'll have us caged before we take a step." David nodded grimly. He had already decided. Miller's advice was not guidance, but bait. But the time had come to confirm it. He left the women with Ranger on guard and stepped into the cold night air, boots crunching across frozen snow. The south gate stood at the far end of the property, an old iron structure half concealed by towering spruce trees. The road beyond curved downhill toward the woods. He crouched low in the brush and waited. Minutes stretched, the cold seeping into his bones, when headlights flared briefly down the slope before flicking off. The faint hum of an idling engine carried on the wind. Through the branches, he saw the dark outline of a vehicle parked beyond the gate, two silhouettes visible inside. One man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, coat collar turned high. He lit a cigarette, the glow flaring orange in the dark. David's eyes sharpened. This was no random passerby. Miller's plan had indeed been a trap. He slipped back toward the house, his mind already moving. By the time he returned to the living room, Samuel Hayes was waiting. Samuel was a county lawyer in his early 40s, summoned quietly by David earlier that evening. He was a man with a bookish appearance, thin frame, rectangular glasses perched on a long nose, hair prematurely graying at the sides. But beneath his mild manner lay a tenacity that had won him difficult cases against men, richer and more ruthless than himself. Tonight, his satchel was filled not with books, but with legal documents and a recorder. "Good you're here," David greeted him, voice low. "We don't have much time." Southgate's compromised Samuel adjusted his glasses, lips pressing thin. "Then you've got a leak. Someone's feeding them directly from under your roof." His gaze flicked briefly toward the hallway where Miller had gone. Maria, her face pale but resolute, spoke up. "We can't just run forever. They'll always find us." "No," David agreed, spreading the blueprint again. "We don't run. We lead them where we want them, and then we take a different road." His finger tapped the northern trail that wound through the forest. "It's rough, narrow, almost forgotten. But if we leave quietly, with Ranger in the lead, we can reach the old ranger's cabin by dawn. From there, Samuel can take us into town with evidence in hand. Emily leaned forward, her eyes wide but determined. "I'll draw it," she said, flipping open her notebook. She sketched the road, the trees, even the cabin. Her small hands trembled, but her lines were steady. "So, we won't forget." Ranger nudged her arm, and she smiled faintly, pressing her cheek to his head. "He'll protect us, won't you?" The dog wagged his tail once, a silent promise. Plans were made in whispers through the night. Samuel checked his documents. Maria whispered prayers under her breath. Emily drew map after map until her eyelids drooped. David remained watchful by the window, his hand always resting near the grip of his sidearm. When the clock neared 11, he stood, his voice firm. "It's time." They moved in silence, the old house holding its breath as they slipped out the back. Snow crunched beneath their boots, Ranger leading with his nose low and ears high. David carried a lantern dimmed to its lowest light, its glow barely reaching the ground. Behind him, Samuel carried his satchel close, while Maria held Emily's hand tightly, refusing to let go. At the south gate, headlights flared again. David froze behind the trees, watching as two men stepped from the vehicle, scanning the darkness. One spoke into a phone, his voice low but urgent. "No movement yet. If they're coming, it'll be now." David's stomach clenched. They were calling Miller, he was sure of it. The butler's betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was truth. He signaled with a hand, and his group veered left, slipping into the narrow northern trail instead. The snow thickened as they entered the woods, branches heavy and low, the path winding and steep. Emily stumbled once, but Ranger immediately circled back, pressing against her side until she steadied. David glanced over his shoulder, hazel eyes catching hers. "Keep moving." Almost there. From behind came the echo of voices, shouts carried faintly on the wind. They had been discovered. David quickened his pace, every step deliberate. The forest closed around them like a shield, but danger pressed close. Ahead, the faint outline of the cabin appeared, its roof sagging but walls intact. Relief surged in his chest. For tonight at least, they had evaded the trap. Inside the cabin, David set the lantern down, its glow spilling across the rough-hewn beams. Samuel dropped his satchel on the table, breath heavy but relieved. Maria collapsed onto a bench, pulling Emily into her arms. Ranger paced the room once, then settled by the door, his body taut with vigilance. David looked around at them all, Maria clutching her daughter, Samuel already organizing his files, Ranger a sentinel at the threshold, and felt the truth harden within him. They had escaped one trap, but the war had only begun. The cabin sat on the northern edge of Silver Pines Forest, where the pines grew so thick that even the snow seemed to hesitate before drifting to the ground. It was small and weathered, built long ago by forest rangers, its logs darkened with age and the roof sagging beneath the weight of ice. Yet to David Monroe and the fragile group he guided there, it was sanctuary. Lantern light flickered against rough-hewn beams as they entered, breathing in air that smelled of damp wood and old smoke. The tension of the flight from the south gate still clung to them, every breath sharp, every ear straining for sounds of pursuit. David moved first through the cabin, his tall frame casting long shadows across the cramped space. He checked locks, hinges, windows, each gesture methodical, his hazel eyes never still. Ranger circled the room once, claws clicking against the wood, then settled by the door, his thick black and silver coat bristling slightly, ears flicking with every gust outside. At 6 years old, Ranger was in the prime of his strength, built for endurance, his amber eyes steady and commanding. For Emily, he was more than a dog. He was a wall of warmth and loyalty. Maria eased onto a bench, her body still frail from exhaustion. Her auburn-brown hair fell loose about her shoulders, her face pale, yet there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. Emily clung to her, refusing to let go, her storm-gray eyes scanning every corner as though shadows might come alive. Samuel Hayes set his satchel heavily on the scarred table, his bookish figure bent slightly under the weight of documents. He looked weary, but his rectangular glasses caught the light with a quiet resolve. "We'll be safe here for the night," David said finally, his voice deep but calm. "This place isn't on any current map. I used to use it years ago during patrols. Few even know it. Stan's Emily tugged at Maria's sleeve. Can we stay forever? Her voice was small, fragile with hope. Maria stroked her daughter's hair. Just for tonight, sweet girl. Tomorrow, we must be braver. Still, Samuel had already unpacked a portable scanner and a small hard drive from his satchel. His thin fingers moved quickly, organizing papers and notes Maria had provided. Each document was fragile, creased with years of fear, but together they formed the backbone of a case. We'll make 3 copies, he explained, voice brisk as though reciting ritual. 1 for the county police, 1 for my firm, and 1 kept here. Evidence vanishes too easily when powerful hands are involved. David nodded, setting a lantern closer. Do it. No margin for error. Maria rose slowly, steadying herself against the bench. Let me do something useful. I can cook. It's the least I can offer. Her voice trembled but carried resolve. The cabin's kitchen was little more than a stove, a rusted kettle, and a row of battered pots. Yet Maria set about her task with care, sleeves rolled, her thin hands working with quiet determination. Emily followed eagerly, fetching water from the pump outside, with Ranger standing guard at her side. The German shepherd never strayed from her, his tail brushing her coat as she carried the heavy bucket. Inside, Maria coaxed flame into the stove, and soon the scent of bubbling porridge filled the air, warm and simple. As steam rose, Maria allowed herself a moment to smile. It's not much, but warmth has saved more than one life. Emily beamed and arranged mismatched spoons like treasures upon the table. It's perfect, she said with childish certainty, clutching her stuffed notebook in one hand and Ranger's collar in the other. While mother and daughter cooked, David joined Samuel at the table. They spread documents across the surface, names, dates, false contracts, and Maria's trembling notes. Emily's drawings were added too, sketches of trucks, warehouses, the long scrape on the gray vehicle's door. Samuel murmured, "Children remember the details adults miss. This will hold weight in court." David's gaze hardened. If it reaches the court. He had seen too many cases buried in silence. His hazel eyes flicked to the window, where snow pressed thick against the glass. Blackwell has people everywhere. We must assume they already know more than we'd like. Far away in town, in a warm and immaculate apartment, Miller sat alone. He was still in his press suit, but the dignity he wore at David's house slipped away here. His silver hair clung damp with sweat, his face lined deeper by regret. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood on the table, beside an envelope filled with crisp bills. The call he had taken hours earlier still echoed in his ears. Edward Blackwell's voice cold, demanding, reminding him of debts unpaid and favors owed. Miller had once been a proud man, the butler of a noble home, but gambling had chipped away at him, debt by debt, until he was ensnared. Blackwell's reach had offered him survival, but at a price that stained him. In the cabin, Maria carried steaming bowls of porridge to the table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes softened as Emily clapped in delight. David took a bowl, steam rising against his weary face, and after a pause, offered a rare smile. "Thank you. This is what we needed." They ate slowly, the warmth spreading through the cold air. Emily whispered between spoonfuls, "Sir, if we tell the police, will we never have to run again?" David met her eyes, his voice firm but gentle. "If we tell the truth and stand together, running will end. But standing will take courage." When the meal was done, Samuel returned to his scanning. Maria signed her name on fresh declarations, her hand shaking but steadying with each stroke. Emily insisted on adding her own drawings as evidence, small but vital truths no adult could invent. Ranger moved between them, a silent presence, his amber eyes steady. As the night deepened, David stepped outside to circle the cabin once more. The lake nearby shimmered dark under the moon, frozen at its edges, whispering under the wind. He scanned every tree, every shadow. Somewhere out there, he knew men were watching. Somewhere out there, Miller was speaking with Blackwell. But inside, warmth lingered, porridge on the stove, documents sealed in envelopes, a girl asleep with her head against her mother's shoulder, and Ranger standing guard by the door. For the first time in years, David felt something stir that was neither grief nor anger. It was fragile, tentative, but real, hope. Morning came slowly over the lake, a pale wash of gray light spilling through the cabin's frosted windows. David Monroe had hardly slept. Instead, he sat in a wooden chair near the door, sidearm within reach, eyes scanning every creak of the logs. Ranger rested beside him, head lifted at the faintest sound, his breath steady, his amber eyes sharp and alive. When dawn finally broke, David rose, stretched his broad shoulders, and knew the moment could not be delayed. Maria and Emily would have to face the law. Maria Alvarez had grown stronger overnight, though the faint hollows beneath her eyes remained. Her auburn hair was brushed but still tangled in places, her skin pale, her frame slender and fragile from weeks of deprivation. Yet, when she held her daughter's hand, her back straightened with a mother's resolve. Emily, small and wide-eyed, clutched her notebook against her chest and leaned close to Ranger, her gray eyes betraying fear but also defiance. Samuel Hayes was already awake, setting files into neat stacks, his rectangular glasses slipping down his nose as he checked each document. His quiet persistence made him appear more like a professor than a lawyer, yet the intensity in his gaze revealed the fighter beneath. He glanced at David. "We need to move. Major Ruiz is expecting us at the precinct. She'll handle this with discretion, but the sooner we file testimony, the harder it becomes for Blackwell to silence it." David nodded. "Load everything. We leave in 10. By mid-morning, the SUV rolled toward Silver Pine's county seat. Snow along the mountain roads sparkled under a fragile sun. Emily sat in the back with Maria, her hand buried in Ranger's thick fur. The dog's steady warmth was her anchor, and every so often she whispered into his ear, secrets too soft for the adults to hear. David drove in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking off into the mirror. Samuel sat in the passenger seat, scanning the road behind them. The precinct was an old brick building with tall white columns that loomed above the street. Outside, flags snapped in the icy wind. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly, the walls lined with framed commendations and maps. The air carried the sharp smell of disinfectant and coffee. It was here that Major Ellen Ruiz waited. Ruiz was a woman of 50, medium height, her hair iron gray pulled into a severe bun. She had the posture of someone who had weathered decades of service and the eyes of someone who had seen more than she wished. Her face bore lines not just of age but of duty, lines carved by long nights and hard truths. Known for her integrity, she had once broken up a smuggling ring against orders from superiors, costing her a promotion but earning her the loyalty of younger officers. Now she stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her presence filling the office even before she spoke. "Monroe," she greeted David with a curt nod, her voice low and steady. "I heard you've brought witnesses." Her gaze softened slightly as it fell on Maria and Emily. "This won't be easy, but it is necessary." Maria stiffened, her hand squeezing Emily's until the girl winced. David placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "They're ready," he said, though his eyes betrayed his concern. Ruiz gestured to a small office down the hall. Private room, no interruptions inside. A single wooden desk sat beneath a humming lamp. Files were stacked neatly, and a recorder lay ready. Ruiz closed the door behind them and sat across from Maria. "Mrs. Alvarez," she began, her tone formal, yet not unkind. "You understand this testimony will put you under witness protection. Once your words are on record, Blackwell cannot erase them easily. But it also means he'll know you've spoken." Maria trembled, her breath catching. Sweat dotted her brow. Emily tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mom, I'll stay with you. You don't have to be afraid." Her young voice carried more courage than her small frame should have held. David leaned forward, his hazel eyes locked on Maria. "You're not signing alone. You're signing for both of you, and I'll stand with you." Maria drew in a breath, then another, each one steadier than the last. With a trembling hand, she took the pen, the tip hovering over the paper. Memories pressed in, voices shouting, the smell of diesel, the echo of a warehouse door slamming shut. For a moment, she froze. Then Emily placed her small hand over hers. Together, they pressed the pen down, strokes uneven but resolute. The name appeared, Maria Alvarez. The room was still, save for the scratching of Samuel's pen as he noted the signature. Ruiz gave a brief nod, her eyes warm despite her stern face. From this moment, you are under protection. She turned to Emily. And you, young lady, anything you remember can be invaluable. Do you wish to say something? Emily lifted her chin, her storm gray eyes wet but steady. I remember everything. The sound of the truck, the scrape on the door, the smell. I won't forget. I'll tell them if they ask. Ranger shifted beside her, sitting upright, his amber eyes gleaming as though he too understood the weight of her words. Maria broke into tears, pulling Emily close, whispering, You're braver than me. Ruiz stood, her voice firm. This is the start, not the end. Blackwell will know soon. He will push back hard, but you are not alone anymore. She looked to David. We'll need to see the site, gather direct evidence. Words are strong, but proof is stronger. Maria's face blanched. You mean, go back there? Ruiz's gaze was unwavering. If you can lead us, we'll bring it down from the inside out. The words struck like a hammer. Maria shook her head violently. No, you don't understand. If we go back, Emily's small voice cut through her. Panic. Mom, we can't let them keep the others. If we don't go, they'll stay trapped forever. Maria turned to her daughter, heart torn open. She saw not a child, but the reflection of all she herself had lost. Courage rising from fear. Slowly, with tears streaming down her cheeks, she gave a faint nod. David placed a steady hand on her arm. Then we'll do it together. You won't face it alone. In that moment, amid fear and uncertainty, the first true alliance was forged, not of convenience, but of conviction. The room seemed smaller, but their resolve felt larger than the walls could contain. The drive to Riverside took them through winding roads where the snow had been pushed into high banks, creating tunnels of white that glowed under the dim headlights. Inside the SUV, silence reigned, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional whimper of wind against the windows. Maria sat stiffly in the back seat, her hand gripping Emily's so tightly the girl's fingers turned pale. Emily, however, did not complain. She sat with her notebook on her lap and Ranger's head resting across her knees, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the passing trees. The German shepherd, broad-shouldered and calm, shifted only to glance toward the windows, his amber eyes alert and watchful. David drove with a soldier's focus, his strong hands steady on the wheel, jaw clenched as though the road itself were an enemy. Beside him sat Samuel Hayes, who read through notes under the glow of a small flashlight, his glasses slipping down his nose. Occasionally Samuel would mutter to himself, adjusting the order of documents or scribbling something in the margins. They arrived at the abandoned warehouse on the edge of Riverside, just as night deepened. The building stood like a relic of despair. Corrugated metal walls, rust streaking down like tears, a yard scattered with broken pallets. A single bulb swayed above the entrance, casting weak pools of yellow light. Major Ellen Ruiz was already there with a small tactical team, their breath clouding in the cold air, rifles slung across winter coats. Ruiz stood at the center, her iron-gray bun as precise as her posture. Her lined face looked carved from granite, yet her dark eyes glimmered with a spark of protectiveness when she saw Emily step out holding Ranger's leash. "This is the place?" Ruiz asked, her tone clipped. Maria's knees buckled at the sight of the building, memories flooding back, the smell of diesel, the echo of boots, the suffocating dark. She clutched Emily against her. "Yes," she whispered, "but something feels wrong. It's too quiet." David scanned the lot, his hazel eyes narrowing. Ranger stiffened beside him, letting out a low growl. "He's right," David muttered, trusting the dog more than silence. They cleared this place. The tactical teams swept in, boots echoing against the concrete. Inside, the warehouse was almost empty. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by recent movement. Ropes dangled from beams, chairs lay toppled, and the faint smell of sweat and fear still clung to the walls. Helen Carter, who had joined them for medical support, crouched near a chair, running her fingers along fresh grooves in the wood. Helen was a practical woman in her mid-30s, auburn hair tied back loosely, her sharp green eyes always scanning for signs of distress. Once a field medic overseas, she carried a quiet strength born of seeing too much loss. Now her voice was grim. "These marks are fresh. They left only hours ago." Maria sank to the floor, tears streaking down her cheeks. "We're too late. They're gone?" Emily knelt beside her mother, whispering, "No, Mom. They're still out there. We just have to find them." David's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. "If you want to save them, don't waste time here. 27 Riverside Street. Don't warn anyone, or you'll be too late again." Signed simply, M. David showed it to Ruiz, who frowned deeply. "Miller," she said flatly, "he's feeding you information now? Why?" "He's desperate," David replied. "Maybe guilt. Maybe survival. Either way, if he's right, we have minutes, not hours." Ruiz considered. She was a woman who did not gamble lightly, but in the end, she gave a sharp nod. "We move." They regrouped quickly, driving deeper into Riverside until the SUV rolled to a stop at an overgrown side road. Ahead loomed another warehouse, smaller, hidden by trees. Unlike the first, faint voices carried from inside, low, desperate murmurs, followed by a cough. Emily pressed close to Ranger, whispering, "They're here, Mom." David motioned for silence. Ruiz's team fanned out, weapons raised. David led with Ranger at his side, the dog's body taut as a bowstring, his nose working the air. At David's signal, Ruiz's men shoved the door open. The sight inside froze Maria's breath. Dozens of women huddled together, eyes wide with terror, their faces pale and gaunt. At the sudden burst of light, they flinched, some shielding their faces, others clutching each other. A child barely older than Emily whimpered from a corner. Helen rushed forward, dropping her medical bag, her hands steady as she checked pulses and wrapped trembling shoulders in blankets. Her voice, calm but urgent, carried through the warehouse. "You're safe now. We're here." Emily slipped free of her mother and knelt before the small child in the corner, offering the only thing she had, a piece of candy from her pocket. "It's okay," she whispered. "I was scared too. But you're safe now." The child burst into tears, throwing tiny arms around Emily's neck. The room seemed to exhale, relief mingling with sobs. Suddenly, a door at the back banged open. 2 guards stumbled out, eyes wide with shock. Before they could raise weapons, Ruiz's team surged forward, rifles trained. The men dropped their guns, hands shaking. Outside, sirens wailed as backup arrived, their red and blue lights splashing across the steel walls. Among those dragged out was Miller himself, his hands cuffed, his silver hair disheveled, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. As he was led past David, his lips trembled. "I couldn't let another child see what I once saw," he whispered. "Not again." His eyes dropped, heavy with regret, as he was pushed toward a waiting van. Maria clung to Emily, both of them sobbing as survivors were escorted out, one by one. David stood in the cold night air, watching it unfold, his broad shoulders rigid, his face carved in shadow. Ranger pressed against his side, his body still tense, but his eyes softer now, as if sensing the battle had, for once, tipped toward hope. The warehouse, once a tomb of despair, now echoed with voices alive and free. Yet David knew the fight was far from finished. Blackwell would not surrender to silence. Tonight was a victory, but only the first. The courthouse in Silver Pine loomed tall against a crisp winter sky, its white stone pillars streaked with years of weather, the flag above snapping in the icy wind. Crowds pressed at the steps, reporters jostling for position, their breath fogging in the cold air. Inside, tension vibrated through the corridors as the case against Edward Blackwell, the man whose name had become synonymous with wealth and untouchable power, was about to begin. David Monroe walked at the head of the group, his heavy coat pulled tight against the cold, his square shoulders carrying the weight of more than the case. Beside him strode Samuel Hayes, his thin frame almost swallowed by the satchel stuffed with documents, his rectangular glasses reflecting flashes of camera lights as reporters shouted questions. Maria Alvarez followed, dressed in a plain but neat blouse and coat provided by witness services, her auburn hair pinned back, Those strands fell loose around her pale but determined face. Emily clung to her hand, a notebook pressed tight to her chest. Ranger walking calmly at her other side, his thick black and silver fur shining under the marble lights of the hall. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stark and unforgiving. The judge, a tall man named Charles Whitford, with thinning white hair and a stern brow, presided with an expression that brooked no nonsense. He was in his late 60s, with a history of handling organized crime cases. His reputation was one of severity but fairness. To his left sat the jury, 12 ordinary men and women, faces tense with the knowledge of the trial's gravity. At the defense table sat Edward Blackwell. In person, he looked smaller than his legend, mid-50s, silver hair combed meticulously, suit tailored to perfection. Yet his pale blue eyes carried an arrogance that filled the room, and his hands, though clasped neatly, twitched when the crowd hushed. He was flanked by 2 attorneys in dark suits, their faces taut, their briefcases brimming with motions designed to delay and confuse. The prosecution began with Helen Carter, who had agreed to testify not just as a doctor, but as a witness. She stood with her auburn hair pinned neatly, her white coat replaced with a conservative navy dress. Calm and methodical, she described the malnutrition, the bruises, and the weakness of the survivors. Her medical reports were displayed on screens for all to see, drawing audible gasps from the gallery. Helen's voice carried the authority of experience. She had patched wounds in battlefields, and no defense lawyer could shake her steady calm. Next came Maria. Her hands shook as she took the stand, but Emily's eyes, watching from the front row, gave her strength. Maria's voice cracked at first, her words tumbling over one another as she described being lured with promises of work, her documents confiscated, her nights locked inside dark warehouses. Then her tone steadied, and she spoke of Emily, the 6-year-old who had seen too much, yet remembered every sound, every scrape of metal. "They promised me hope," she said, her storm gray eyes bright with tears. "But they gave me chains. If it weren't for him—" She glanced toward David, then swallowed her words. "If it weren't for the people who refused to turn away, I wouldn't be alive to speak today." The defense tried to discredit her, pointing out her lack of formal proof. But when Emily was called, the courtroom shifted. The child walked carefully to the stand, her small frame dwarfed by the wooden seat. She placed her notebook on the table and opened it, showing sketches of trucks, a warehouse with ropes drawn in sharp lines, and a car door with a deep scrape. Her voice, though soft, rang clear. "I drew what I saw so I wouldn't forget. I remember the sound, beep, beep, when the truck backed up. And I remember the smell, like gas and metal. I was scared, but I kept remembering, because I knew one day someone would need to know." The gallery fell silent. Even Judge Whitford leaned forward, studying the child with a mixture of gravity and sorrow. No cross-examination could unsettle her. When asked if she was certain, she replied simply, "I don't forget." Miller was the final unexpected witness, brought in shackles, his silver hair disheveled, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked far older than his years. His voice trembled as he described how Blackwell had ensnared him, how debts and threats had turned loyalty into betrayal. "I was a coward," he admitted, eyes darting once toward Emily. "But when I saw her looking at me, I remembered the boy I once was, forced to watch helplessly. I couldn't let her see the same darkness." His confession sealed the case, his words a mix of guilt and redemption. Samuel presented the final evidence: the security logs, the documents Maria signed, Emily's drawings, Helen's reports, and Miller's testimony woven into a chain too strong to break. When the defense sputtered objections, Whitford overruled them with curt authority. At last, the gavel struck. Judge Whitford's voice rang through the silent hall. "The court finds Edward Blackwell guilty on all charges." The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Survivors wept openly. And Maria collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing with relief. David closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to see Ranger pressing against his leg, tail wagging faintly as though sensing the weight lifted from the air. Months later, Silverpine knew a different scene. David's once empty house now rang with laughter. Maria tended a small garden near the back porch, her hands busy with life rather than fear. Emily painted signs with bright colors, Ranger lying content at her side, occasionally rolling over to nudge her brush with his nose. Samuel visited often, his glasses perpetually slipping as he helped Emily with her writing, and Helen dropped by. With baked bread, her green eyes softer now than anyone remembered. One afternoon, Emily unveiled a wooden sign she had carved with David's help. The letters were shaky but bold, the House of Light. She painted a sun above the words, yellow and radiant. Maria hung it on the front gate while David stood behind them, his broad frame shadowing but no longer looming. "Like the clever fox," Emily whispered, clutching Ranger's fur. "It always finds its way home." David bent down, resting his hand on Maria's shoulder and pulling Emily close. For years he had carried grief like an anchor, but now, in this house filled with warmth, he felt something new. Not just hope, but belonging. And so, the mansion that once echoed with silence became a refuge, a place where shadows were replaced by light, where love was rebuilt from brokenness. For David, Maria, Emily, and Ranger, it was not merely survival. It was a beginning. In the end, this story reminds us that miracles are not only found in grand moments, but in the quiet courage to stand for what is right, in the hand that reaches out when hope seems lost, and in the love that binds a broken family together. Just like the little girl's prayer was answered, we are reminded of the miracles of God that still shine in our daily lives if we dare to believe. Wherever you are watching from, may the Lord bless you and your loved ones with strength and light. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith and redemption. And if you believe in the power of God's miracles, write Amen in the comments below.